We need to include salt in our diets. There's a lot of misinformation about salt. There really has been a concerted push to get Americans to reduce salt to way below their needs. Now, we absolutely need 1.5 teaspoons of salt every day.
Welcome to the Wise Traditions Podcast, sponsored by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
I'm your host, Hoda Labrada Gore. This is episode 105, and my guest is Fallon Morell. Sally is the head of the Weston A. Price Foundation, and she is a world-renowned speaker, author, and activist for food freedom. Today, she discusses with us principle number 9 of the Wise Traditions diet. That is, that all traditional diets contain some salt. Salt is critical for proper brain and body functionality. Low salt consumption has been linked to metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, poor digestion, parasites, and depression. Does this mean we should all go out and grab a bag of potato chips? I don't think so. But listen as Fallon Morell explains what kind of salts we should be consuming and the amazing benefits of salt. Before we get into the conversation, we want to recognize our sponsors. The Wise Traditions podcast is supported in part by Perfect Supplements. Perfect Supplements is a proud sponsor of the Wise Traditions Journal and conferences. Visit perfectsupplements.com for all of your favorite whole food and organic superfoods. And Defender Shield. Protect yourself and your family from EMF radiation from cell phones, laptops, tablets, iPads, and more. Visit defendershield.com. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Sally.
Thank you, Hilda. It's great to be back. I guess we're doing principle number 9.
That's right. We're going slowly but surely through the 11 principles of the Weston A. Price Foundation based on the findings of Dr. Price. So what's number 9 about?
Well, number 9 is about salt, and we do need salt. We need to include salt in our diets.
Well, that's not what the conventional medicine people say.
You know, like the subject of fats, like so many subjects out there, there's a lot of misinformation about salt. There really has been a concerted push to get Americans to reduce salt to way below their needs. Now, we absolutely need 1.5 teaspoons of salt every day. And the idea is to get us down to 3/4 teaspoon per day. And you're going to see a lot of very serious health consequences from that.
Is it because there have been studies that have linked high sodium levels in our diet to heart disease and high blood pressure?
Yes, that's the argument that's being used. The so-called DASH diet, which is for people with high blood pressure, is a very low salt diet. But the studies show that salt reduction will help about 10% of people with high blood pressure. Another 10%, their blood pressure goes up when they reduce salt. And about 80% of the population, it doesn't have any effect on their blood pressure. So just like for heart disease and lowering cholesterol, that might be a strategy for 1 or 2% of the population, people with extremely high cholesterol, but it's being applied to everybody. So same with the salt. Studies have shown that, yes, a small portion of people with high blood pressure benefit from lowering their salt intake, but now it's being applied to everyone, and not just people with high blood pressure, but everyone. They want this to be population-wide.
Across the board.
Across the board, yes. And let's start with the fact that your body needs sodium. We need sodium. The basic reason we need sodium is to have osmotic pressure on the inside, a different pressure on the inside and the outside of the cell. Our bodies are supposed to be salty, and we need 1.5 teaspoons of salt to give us the amount of sodium required to have that osmotic pressure, and we need that every day. Now, what people don't realize, and that's kind of a surprise, we eat a lot less salt than we used to. We have information showing that between the War of 1812 and the First World War, our salt consumption was about double. It's about 3 teaspoons a day. And that's because we were using salt to preserve our meat. So even though we do have a lot of, fast foods, chips and things that are very salty today, we are not preserving our foods in salt. So we actually are eating less salt than we used to eat.
That's fascinating. But it's not surprising because salt was used to cure meats, as you said, and so it was used traditionally all over the place. So people were consuming more salt, and yet they weren't struggling with high blood pressure, were they?
Well, we don't think so, and certainly not with heart disease and myocardial infarction like we have today. In the past, you could only have a culture, a civilization where you had salt, because you absolutely needed salt to preserve meats and this sort of thing. Now, there were some cultures that didn't have that much salt, and then they ate plants and insects and things that were naturally salty, or they consumed the blood of their animals to get salt. The Eskimos, for example, blood was a very important part of their diet because it's salty. In the South Seas, they put salt water in their foods, the seawater, and they actually traded. The people who were growing taro root in the interior of the islands would trade salt water for the taro roots so they could have salt.
That is fascinating. And I know there are a lot of sayings like he's worth his weight in salt, yes, right? And things like that show how valuable salt was to these cultures.
Yes, and it was also used as a way to control people. So the salt tax, the Romans would withhold salt from people they wanted to destroy. And they had a salt tax in India. It was why there was the uprising in India that Gandhi led. It was because the British were basically denying salt to the people. So when you don't have enough salt, you develop some very, very serious health problems. And the other thing that salt is really important for is neurological development. We have two types of cells in our brains, the white cells and the gray cells. And I think the gray cells are the glial cells that help us make connections, that help us do creative thinking, to put two and two together, so to speak. When they studied Einstein's brain, he gave his brain to science. You see, he had lots and lots of glial cells. And you need salt to develop your glial cells in your brain. So to have a civilization, to have enough people who can run your civilization, you just definitely need a lot of salt.
And we kind of naturally crave salt, don't we?
We do. We have a salty taste in our mouth. It's not there to torture us. It's there because we need to put salt on our food. We need quite a bit of salt, much more of the sodium than we do of any other minerals. We also need the chloride in salt. So the chloride is in salt. Salt is sodium chloride. The body uses chloride to make hydrochloric acid, and that's what we need for digesting meat. And a lot of people say, oh, I can't digest meat. It's probably because they're on low-salt diets. The other thing I've had doctors tell me, which is very interesting, is people who go on low-salt diets are much more prone to getting parasites because they don't have the hydrochloric acid in their stomach, which is a very strong acid. There's a pH of about 2. That's your first defense against parasites. So, salt is very important.
Now, the quality of the salt matters too, though. When you say we should make sure that we get sufficient salt in our diets, you're not talking about table salt, regular table salt that you'd buy at the store, right?
Well, table salt is better than nothing. And one of the things I like to point out is that in the sense that we have adequate salt, everybody has salt today. It's not taxed, it's not expensive, it's very plentiful. That is one of the advantages of the civilized diet that traditional cultures didn't necessarily have. They really had to make sure that they got salt, and sometimes they didn't get salt. And as modern people, we always have access to salt, and that's a great advantage. But yes, we do recommend unrefined salt. Because what happens in salt manufacture, they take the evaporated seawater, which is full of trace minerals, got a lot of magnesium in it, for example. It's about 10% magnesium. And then they refine it. So it goes through a very heated refining process that removes all the trace minerals, removes the magnesium. So all you have left is sodium chloride. And then they add an aluminum compound to make the salt pour when it rains. Yeah, I remember going to my grandmother's. She had little salt bowls. Do you remember those on the table? Yes, because in the old days, the salt wouldn't come out of the salt shaker. Or you added grains of rice to the salt shaker. But once Morton started to refine the salt, then it would pour when it rains.
Now, isn't aluminum bad for us?
Yes. So there's an aluminum compound in the regular salt, and that's a very good reason to avoid refined salt and to avoid processed foods because, that's going to be used in processed foods. So Tom Cowan, Dr. Tom on our board, says that his number one treatment for high blood pressure is to tell people to just use unrefined salt. And it almost always works. Their blood pressure comes down, and of course, it's a way of getting them off of processed food also.
So we want the salt. Okay, we can have the table salt, but we really want salt that has these trace minerals you're describing. That's like a Himalayan salt, sea salt. Talk to us a little bit about those differences as best you can.
Okay, so there are lots and lots of brands of unrefined salt, and the shopping guide put out by the Weston A. Price Foundation lists all these brands, and they basically fall into two categories. One is evaporated seawater, and the other is mined salt. So that would be salt from Poland or salt from the Himalayas, or salt from Utah. There's mined salt from Utah, and these are all good sources of salt. I like to say your salt should be gray, pink, or beige, and not white. Because if it's white, it's been refined.
Good point. Good point. So let's go back to the high blood pressure topic. You said that salt, at least as some prescribe it, can actually be helpful to lower it and get it down to a normal rate. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that?
Yes. One of the things that happens if you don't eat enough salt is that you get metabolic syndrome. And that's characterized by high blood pressure. The other thing that happens is insulin resistance. And there was a very dramatic study where they put a number of volunteers on a no-salt diet and did certain tests every day. And within 1 week, every single one of these volunteers had developed insulin resistance. So now you're talking about diabetes, metabolic syndrome, all sorts of problems from not having enough salt.
But I feel like everything's labeled low sodium, low sodium. Should we be glad about that or not, Sally?
Yeah, no, that's not a good idea. You absolutely need sodium. Another thing that the studies have shown is that high salt consumption is associated with longevity. So people who get plenty of salt, who satisfy their body's requirements for sodium and chloride by eating salt, they live longer. And I have discovered something very interesting that if I take a pinch of salt before I go to bed at night, I fall right to sleep. It's the best treatment for insomnia that I know of. And that tells me that salt is somehow involved with the adrenal glands, just helping the adrenal glands to relax. We know that people who are under a lot of stress need salt, need more salt. There's certain conditions where they need, very large amounts of salt. I think President Kennedy had one of those. I think it was Addison's disease, and those people are using up salt at a great rate because the adrenal glands need salt, and so they need to eat a lot of salt. Well, it's interesting that taking that pinch of salt before going to bed, you just zonk out. Your adrenal glands relax.
Now, this sounds fantastic. What about children? How much salt should they take in?
Children absolutely need salt during the period of growth. Of course, they need salt for digestion, but they also need salt for neurological development. There was a very interesting legal case. It was called the Neomulce formula case. Mary Enig was actually an expert witness in this case, where they thought, we're going to make this infant formula better, and we're going to leave out the sodium, which they did, and the babies became mentally retarded, and there was a big payout in the case, and the company went out of business. So the formula makers know very well they have to add sodium to the infant formula. So yes, children definitely need sodium for growth, but for neurological development as well.
And salt also has the benefit of making things taste better, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Now, what happens if we go to everything's going to be low in salt? We're going to keep the salt out of the food. Well, the industry they have these salt substitutes that stimulate the salt taste buds in your tongue and make you think you're eating salt. So you're going to eat these foods, and they taste okay, right? But the body is going to be saying to you, wait, I didn't get salt here, so you need to eat more and more and more. And I think what you'll see is a huge increase in obesity if they do as planned, which is there's this substance called Simonix. And it's needed in such small amounts that they don't have to get approval from the FDA to use it, and they don't have to label it. So if you see something that says low sodium, I would just run as fast as you can away from this food, because it's probably got this terrible additive in it, and your body is not going to be tricked. It's going to say, wait, I need to eat more of this because I'm not getting the sodium I need.
Oh, yeah, that's a theory I have a lot of times too, that our body is still searching for the nutrient that's missing. When you eat something that's like low fat, of course we know we need fat, but your body's thinking, okay, I want this, but where's the fat? Yeah, right. And so you keep eating it. And that's one reason people eat kind of compulsively sometimes,
yes.
I think.
Yes, I like to tell a story about people who avoid fat all day long and don't eat butter. And by 9 o'clock at night, they're absolutely starving for fat. And they go to the freezer and they eat a half a gallon of ice cream, standing there right there with the freezer door still open. They can't stop from eating this ice cream to get the fats they need. And it's the same thing with salt. So again, why not just eat your salt with your meals, do your lovely unrefined salt, and then you can't make promises, but you be much less likely to crave a bag of chips in the afternoon.
Oh, that sounds fantastic. Now, my question is, won't all this salt make us especially thirsty?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, I add a pinch of salt to the water I drink because that puts minerals in the water. That's a good question. And I'm not sure I know the answer, but certainly the average amount of salt that people should be eating, 1.5 teaspoons a day, and that's throughout the day on your food. That's not necessarily going to be making people more thirsty.
Coming up, the fascinating results of a study conducted in England in the 1930s. What happens when salt is completely removed from the diet? And now we want to pause and recognize our sponsors, Perfect Supplements. Perfect Supplements is a proud sponsor of the Wise Traditions Conferences and was founded by a Weston A. Price Foundation local chapter leader. Perfect Supplements provides whole food and organic and grass-fed superfoods, including desiccated liver, collagen, spirulina, and chlorella. Save $5 at checkout with coupon code WISE5 at perfectsupplements.com. And Defender Shield. Defender Shield is the worldwide leader in mobile radiation shielding. They have been tested by FCC-certified labs. Defender Shield is the first technology to block up to virtually 100% of electromagnetic radiation from laptops, tablets, and cell phones, making it the most effective shielding for mobile devices ever developed. For more information, go to defendershield.com and use the coupon code WISETRADITIONS10 for a 10% discount at checkout. Can you talk a little bit more about studies and what they've found? Because I know people like to hear the science behind all of this.
Yes. One very interesting study took place way back in 1936 in England, and they put 3 human beings on a completely salt-free diet combined with sweating, so it was to quickly reduce the amount of salt in the diet. They immediately lost weight and began to look ill. Their sense of taste and smell was affected. The foods became tasteless, and fatty foods made them nauseous. Now, this is very interesting because people tell me I can't eat fats because they make me nauseous. It might be because they're not getting enough salt in their diet. And interestingly enough, they drank lots of water. They couldn't get enough water. They got no relief from the sensation of thirst. 2 of the 3 were troubled with nightmares. Now, once again, there's the salt being able to help you to sleep. They suffered from frequent cramps. They became apathetic and had difficulty speaking. And their mental capacity was dulled. All returned to normal health and vigor once they started eating salt again.
And who conducted that study?
This was a really seminal study. His name was McCants, and this was in England. A study with rats, researchers found that rats on salt-deprived diets shied away from activities they normally enjoyed, so it's a sign of depression. And they concluded that salt is a natural mood buster. Mary Enig told me a wonderful story years ago. Apparently, up to the year 500 AD, there was a very vigorous salt trade all over Europe, and the salt was evaporated from the Atlantic Ocean, and then it was traded all into the interior. And in 500 AD, the seas rose about 50 feet and covered all these salt pans over, and the salt trade was wiped out overnight. And what happened was and that's when the Dark Ages started. It stopped the trade, but also people just didn't have enough salt to be intelligent. And it was only when they got that salt going again, which wasn't until about the year 1000, that they kind of came out of these Dark Ages.
Wow, that is fascinating, and a tribute to what you're saying. Salt is essential for proper brain function.
That's right.
Now, I do want to tell you, I saw some people asking a question recently on one of our social media platforms. They were saying that they were a little bit afraid of sea salt because our oceans are so polluted. What would you say to them?
We've learned this recently, that they found really tiny particles of plastic in the sea salt. I wouldn't panic. They also said that if you were eating a normal amount of sea salt, you'd probably get 6 of these particles per day. And you don't digest these particles. I mean, they're excreted. So I don't think this is the biggest threat out there. And what I would like to do is test all different varieties of salt for these kind of impurities. But I'm still using sea salt.
Well, that's one thing I like about the foundation, is that research is one branch of its work. So hopefully we'll get that salt study done and be able to tell people what they should do. But you're not alarmed.
No, I'm not alarmed by this. I also think that on our good diet, you can really handle a lot, and we definitely live in a toxic world. I'd be more concerned about the aluminum in processed salt than particles of plastic in sea salt.
I wonder if some people are afraid of eating too much salt because doesn't salt make you retain water? So they're afraid they're going to get bloated or something. What do you think of that, Sally?
I think normal salt consumption, that wouldn't happen. If you are retaining water when you eat any salt, and I know there are a few people like this, I would look to hormonal imbalance, and I would increase your consumption of fats and especially of vitamin A, so that your body can make all these adrenal hormones that organize your body and make sure that everything's working properly.
So let's go back to other concerns people have and studies that have been done, maybe pertaining to asthma or obesity.
Yes, there was one theory that salt inhibits bronchial function in the lungs, and that it contributes to asthma. So they did a big study on this, and they found that wasn't the case. There was no evidence that eating salt or eating too much salt contributed to asthma.
Oh, excellent.
Okay. Same thing with that obesity. Again, yes, if you're eating a lot of junk food, yes, you're going to gain weight, but I don't think it's necessarily the salt that's making you gain weight. And if you're restricting salt, you're going to just eat and eat to get the salt you need. It's always about nutrient density, Hilda. The more dense the vitamins and minerals are in our food, the less we have to eat to actually feed the body and to satisfy all our nutritional requirements.
That is so true. This morning I didn't have time for breakfast, and I know intermittent fasting is sometimes recommended by the foundation. And I was like, wow, I taught an exercise class and I felt fine. In the past, I would have been feeling my blood sugar dip, and I wouldn't have been able to handle it. So this is not salt related. But I just wanted to say, you're so right. It's all about nutrient density.
Talking about nutrient density, there was an article in the Washington Post, actually a whole section devoted to agriculture, what's happening in agriculture. And there were interviews with various agricultural people talking about the future. Well, one of the future is this new type of genetic engineering called CRISPR, and there's all kinds of praise for this new type of way we're going to manipulate the plants. And then the other article was about having these computers on their tractors so they could figure out just exactly how much fertilizer to drip on each part of the field. There wasn't, and it's all about growing a lot of food for export. That's all they're thinking about. Export, export, export. Nobody in our Department of Agriculture is thinking about food as something that nourishes us. And not a single taxpayer dollar is being spent on figuring out how to grow food that's full of nutrients. There's just no comprehension of this. And the salt fits right in here. Nobody's thinking, how can we make our salt as nutrient dense as possible? Where are the most nutrient dense salts? Where are the salts with the most trace minerals in them? Nobody's doing that kind of research.
That is such a shame. It's so disappointing, but not surprising, because we're about quantity, not quality of food, right? That's why they're looking at how can we get the biggest yield and the most animals in this 1 square foot, right?
Right. And how can we get people to eat the most food? I mean, they talk about obesity and everything, but really the food pyramid and all of this low fat, low salt, it's a way of getting people to eat and eat and eat, to buy lots of food. And that's the purpose of the Department of Agriculture. It's not to create nourishing food. It's to create a product for export or a product to be manipulated into junk food that's cheap and makes a lot of money for a few people.
That's really disappointing, but it seems like the bottom line is not our health, but the dollar, right?
The dollar. And no one's going to change this for you. We're not going to change the mindset at the Department of Agriculture. I like to say that our food is regulated by people who use non-dairy creamer. You're not going to change them. And our government, our current president drinks diet sodas. I mean, it's not going to change from the top, and it never will. It only is going to change one person at a time. Waking up, getting the picture, and choosing to eat nutrient-dense food and getting their food from farmers who are producing nutrient-dense food. So I like to say this is nature's way of dealing with this problem. It's the natural selection of the wise. And people who continue to eat junk food that's depleted, eventually they will die out. And it sounds really cruel, but they just won't have children. And the people, I like to call them the furry little mammals who are coming along, who are eating nutrient-dense food, making wise choices, they'll have healthy children. And I like to say these healthy children will solve all these problems for us.
I certainly hope so. Well, we're going to wrap it up now. I want to ask you the question I often ask. If the listener could only do one thing to improve their health, maybe related to salt in this case, what would you recommend that they do?
Yes, well, based on our discussion today, I would say you don't have to cut back on salt, but only use unrefined salt. In your cooking, put on your food, that's fine. Don't ever feel guilty about that, but just make the choice for unrefined salt. And that will have the very happy consequence of not eating junk food, because there's no unrefined salt in junk food.
That's excellent, Sally. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
My guest today was Sally Fallon Morell. To connect with Sally, go to the website for the foundation, westonaprice.org, or follow her personal blog at nourishingtraditions.com. For an overview of today's discussion and links to resources mentioned on the show, go to westonaprice.org, click on the tab for blogs and podcasts, and find the show notes for episode 105. Hey, and a big thank you to Podcast Village. Charlie Burney and his team are great at what they do. They are pros when it comes to training, producing, and promoting podcasts. Check them out at podcastvillage.com. Hey, and special thanks to editor Sarah Fernandez and the team of interns for the show, Cynthia Castro Cohen Enriquez, Joy de los Santos, Alexma Alvarado, Kristen Files, and Lily Hempft. Thanks also to Amy Marvin for her help transcribing episodes. Do you want to lend a hand? There's always something to do. Shoot us an email at podcast@westonaprice.org and we'll find a place for you on our team. Hey, and don't forget to look for me at Holistic Hilda on Twitter, at Holistic_Hilda on Instagram. I would love to connect with you, get your feedback on this or any episode really, and connect on matters of wellness. Thanks, everybody, and keep listening.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with others. Post a link on Facebook or Twitter, or send a link to a friend in an email, or simply review Wise Traditions on iTunes. Sharing the podcast is one way to spread the important message of health through nutrition. Wise Traditions is brought to you by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. The content of this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for medical advice.